My name is Sarah Buchanan, and I am the coordinator for the Clean Economy Alliance. We're a coalition of over 100 organizations and businesses, clean tech firms, labor unions, health advocates, and many more from across Ontario. And today we're going to discuss Ontario's new plan to regulate and price industrial pollution. It's called the Industrial Emission Performance Standards, or EPS. And for background, Ontario's new proposal follows on a commitment in their environment plan, which was released in December, to bring in a system to reduce greenhouse gas emissions for industrial polluters. And this surprised some people, the system, because of it has a few similarities to the federal government's output-based pricing system for industrial polluters, which the Ontario government is currently fighting in court. And alongside the fuel levy, which is accompanying it. And there's even a few similarities to Ontario's previous cap and trade program, which also surprised some people. So today we've brought in a few specialists to talk a little bit about this new proposal that Ontario has put on the table, what it means, and where it might bring us in the future. So I'll introduce our special guests before we get started. First, we have Isabelle Turcotte and Robin Edger from the Pembina Institute. Isabelle is the Director of Federal Policy at the Pembina Institute, where she supports the execution of the federal climate and energy strategy. She's been extensively involved in the federal government's ongoing consultation process to develop the pan-Canadian approach to pricing pollution, including the output-based pricing regulations. And Robin Edger is the Ontario Regional Director at the Pembina Institute. And he supports the execution of the provincial climate and energy strategy, transportation decarbonization, and plays a leading role in the carbon pricing work that Pembina Institute does. And they're going to present together. We're also going to have Michael Berends, who's a Managing Director of Origination at ClearBlue Markets, with over 15 years experience in carbon markets, in particular with carbon pricing strategy, offset development and trading. And also we're going to have, last but not least, Katie Sullivan from IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, who's the Managing Director of IETA, who is the premier global multi-sector business voice for the intersection of markets and climate change. So we have a really great set of people today who are going to be able to fill you in on lots of information on this. A few logistics: if you have questions during the presentation, just type it into the Q&A box, which is along your top control panel bar. And feel free to type it in at any point during the presentation. And then we'll get to it between each presentation. I'll pop over and see if there's any questions, and I'll read them out. And you can direct them to any speakers or all speakers if you like. And a reminder that this very proposal that we're talking about today is actually up for consultation and for comment. So you can submit your feedback on this proposal through the Environmental Registry of Ontario until March 29th. So that's 2 weeks from now. So I'm going to now hand it over to Isabelle and Robin, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that they can share their screen and start talking.
Hello. How's that?
Great. Okay.
We're connected. All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the introduction, Sarah. So I'm Isabelle, and I'm accompanied by my colleague, Robin, who's allowed me to take over the airwaves for most of the presentation today, as my experience informing the development of the federal government's output-based pricing system is really relevant as we're looking into this proposed emissions performance standards from the Ontario government. However, he really is the resource for the broader context in which this falls into. So he'll be a very useful resource for the questions I'm sure that some of us might have. So let's jump into this presentation. Yes. So here's a little bit of an outline for what I'll be discussing, a state of play of Ontario's emissions trends, or a quick recap of climate policy in Ontario, and then we'll go into some policy principles for building an output-based pricing system, and we'll discuss how these policy principles are compare with the Ontario proposed environmental performance systems. and I'll finish with a few concluding remarks. So here we are looking at the emissions profiles for every province in the country. And just quickly to put us into context, Ontario is the second largest emitter, and so therefore obviously has a key role to play in meeting our Paris commitment and in making sure that we're building a low carbon and a competitive economy here in Canada. This second slide focuses on the different sectors and how their emissions have evolved with time. And so, of course, we've seen tremendous success in reducing emissions in some sectors, but we still have in Ontario some challenges. And our three largest emitting sectors remain transportation, buildings, and heavy industries, with 19% heavy industries of total emissions. So there's no way that we can decarbonize the economy without addressing those sectors. And so it's really important that the proposed pricing system for this sector is really stringent and does this and attacks this challenge. So here we go for a little quick recap of climate policy in Ontario. I'm not going to go through each point on this slide. They'll be available for folks who want to revisit the tumultuous last months. But I just wanted to highlight that since June 2018, climate policy decisions in Ontario have been really costly for Ontarians and businesses and have created a difficult investment environment, as well as left the province without a credible and holistic plan to address what's most important for Ontarians, which is climate change, such an important health issue and economic issue. So the work that Pembina has been doing, developing similar systems in Alberta with the output-based allocation system that's been in place for a bit over a year now, and the work that we've been doing at the federal level, developing the output-based pricing system, has really enabled us to acquire quite a bit of expertise in how to build strong output-based pricing system. And we've developed a set of policy principles that guides our comments and our analysis of the proposed system in Ontario. And I want to go through these policy principles with you, where if we want a strong output-based system, we want a system that, that one, very importantly, maintains an incentive to reduce carbon pollution, that it be targeted. Yes, we do need to protect emission incentive and trade exposed sectors, but only those who really can demonstrate materials competitiveness impacts should get such relief. Thirdly, the system should be transparent. So any sector that gets relief, we need to see how that's justified by data and analysis in a transparent way. The system has to be consistent and fair, meaning that all sectors regulated under the system must be treated the same way. It must be temporary. So if we want to move towards decarbonization of the economy, the relief that we're giving these sectors needs to be phased out gradually with time as they get a chance to adjust to the system and put in place the innovations that allow them to reduce their emissions. And finally, as a last principle, the system has to be simple to implement, administer, and to comply with. So I'm going to go through a few of the key elements of the proposed Ontario EPS and give our first comments on the system, starting with the sectors that are proposed to be covered. So Ontario is proposing to cover the same sectors as under the federal OBPS. And we think that's fair, but again, any sector that will be regulated under the system, it must be demonstrated that they are really at risk of competitiveness pressure and at risk of leakage. We do not believe, and analysis demonstrate that electricity generation, institutions, greenhouse gas operators, thermal energy supply do not fall under this category. Types of emissions. So Ontario is proposing to cover fixed and non-fixed emissions, and we make a recommendation to eventually include vented fugitive and flared emissions from oil and gas as our ability to quantify these emissions increases. This will really create opportunities for low-cost mitigation in this sector, and just reduce what is a waste of resources. So now let's look a little bit at the proposed performance standards themselves. Ontario is proposing to establish performance standards on a sector basis, and to establish separate performance standards for fixed and non-fixed process emissions. And so our comment on that very, very broadly is that to drive innovations, the sector standards should really be based on who the best performers are in this sector. And we do not believe that setting a separate standard for fixed and process emissions is a good idea. It weakens the signal and limits that signal for innovation, and this is not the approach that's been used elsewhere for similar systems, including Alberta, British Columbia, and the federal program, where there's only one system, one standard applied. So there's a lot of information on this slide on the proposed performance standards, but I just want to highlight that as currently proposed, the signal is quite weak. On a sector basis, 100% of pollutions from fixed emissions would be free, and between 98 to 95% of the emissions would be free in 2019. And this compares not too favorably to a similar system put in place, namely the federal system, where 80% of pollution from fixed and non-fixed emissions would be free, with some exceptions that have gotten a slightly more lenient standard to account for demonstrated need for relief because of competitiveness pressures. Another comment is that the safety factor for low category should be differentiated here from the medium category, because essentially there's no medium and low, they're just one category. Now, looking specifically at the performance standards that propose for electricity generation, we've argued at every level in Alberta and then the federal level that electricity is neither emission intensive and trade exposed and should not be included in such a system, but a compromise solution where the jurisdiction really pushes on including it. Well, we'd say that the average emission intensity for electricity is much lower than 420 in Ontario. It's closer to 150, and best in class in natural gas is 370. So we'd like to see the standard be closer to that. Just looking at the time here, I have some comments on compliance mechanisms. Really quickly, I would just say that we need to make sure that any voluntary credits that are generated and are eligible for compliance have to be real, additional, verifiable, and permanent. So we made some comments on the method, the proposed analysis for assessing the need for relief. And again, here really quickly, the proposed method from the Ontario government doesn't isolate for carbon pricing. So there's numerous factors that will influence a firm's competitiveness. And the pricing system here should not be correcting for any other of these factors that influences the firm's competitiveness, such as wages in a competing jurisdiction or the tax system. It should really isolate for the impact of carbon pricing. So I'm going to skip through this and just highlight that ultimately our recommendation is to apply the same method for analysis as used by the Alberta and the federal government for assessing the need for relief, and therefore assessing what safety factor is appropriate for each sector. And finally, I would like to leave us on an encouraging note and just bring to your attention a report that's been published recently by the Energy Transition Commission, which is a coalition of businesses and finance groups and civil society from across the globe and across industry sectors that say, we can achieve this. We can decarbonize those hard to abate sectors. It's technically feasible and it's economically feasible. Let's make sure that Ontario is on board and building their strong economy.
Great. Thanks, Isabelle. Okay.
Let me maybe just find the button to stop sharing my screen.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a lot of buttons in this software. So audience, bear with us for a moment while we
Got it.
Position. Great. And Michael, if you can click the start sharing your screen button, then we can just roll. Actually, you know what? I'm going to take a second to say, do we have any questions? I don't see any in the Q&A. I'm going to give you like 10 seconds, audience, if you do want to pop in any questions right now for Isabelle or Robin, please do so. If not, you can always ask them at the end of the webinar. We're going to leave time for general questions for any of the speakers there. So I don't see any questions right now. So let's go to Michael. Are you there? Oh, hold on. What is EITE? And Isabelle, I'm going to let you spell that one out and take a second there.
I'm really sorry. I realized that I forget to spell out some of our acronyms. I'm just too deep into it, always working on this. So emission intensive and trade exposed sectors. So those are the sectors that are including the cement industry, the lime industry, steel industry, the ones that are really need a lot of energy and produce a lot of emissions to produce whatever it is that they produce. And so there's a recognition that because they compete with jurisdictions, foreign jurisdictions, where there might not be a price on pollution, and this is increasingly not the case as carbon pricing is becoming the norm across the world. But there's a recognition that there might be a need to just provide some relief for these sectors through systems like the one proposed by the federal government, the Alberta government, and the Ontario government, where there's a subsidy on the price on pollution, a subsidy on production, to make sure that they're not, their competitiveness is not hurt by our climate policies, and that ultimately Canadians benefit environmentally and economically from our climate policy. And we're encouraging clean production at home.
Great. Okay. And Kim says, thank you for answering that, Isabelle.
My pleasure.
I don't see any more questions for right now. So Michael, do you want to take it away?
Sure. I'm going to try to figure out these buttons as well.
Yeah. Oh my God. I was like, shut up. This is way too bad. Yeah. It's a lot of info.
Isabelle, go ahead. If you can mute yourself, then great. Okay. Thanks.
Hi. Does that work? Do you see our?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. And I should also make sure that I introduce also Aida is with me, and so is my Alejandro. So I think Alejandro will probably jump in on 2 slides. So thank you for having us on the webinar today. And thank you, Isabelle, for that presentation. I think there's a few items that we also had on there. So you did a great job starting off the program. So I think we might skip a few things, but I think from our side, to give you some perspective to the group, is that we've been very busy. Well, we were extremely busy with cap and trade in Ontario. And then we saw what happened with cap and trade in Ontario. And then we transitioned quickly for many of our clients into the federal OBS system, which of course has been very busy and continues to be very busy. And now we see another program being developed by Ontario. And of course, all these different programs coming and going raises a lot of questions, a lot of concerns for those that are impacted by them. And I think, one thing we like to highlight in all of this, I think from the industry's point of view, people are getting tired. And I think what we need to really understand is that in the bigger picture, I think we all agree that something needs to be done. And I think the political market uncertainty is not to anyone's benefit. I think that's something that's very important in all of this. And unfortunately, and we can maybe get into this after, and I think Katie might get into that as well, a lot of this market uncertainty, political, regulatory uncertainty is not really conducive to really achieving what we want to achieve here. So hopefully things will be cleared up in sometime in the near future. But we do have some thoughts on that as well, including on the likelihood of this program ever being relevant. So we'll get into that later on, but I think that's a big topic for this plan is, will it ever be in place, and what is the need to be involved in this program, to be very honest. So I think as Isabelle mentioned, their goals and what the plan is here for, and I think to be very direct, the aim of this program is to replace the federal OBPS. And what's important to understand here is, if you look at this program, there is no carbon levy component to this program. And what our understanding is that the aim of the MECP and the Ontario government is to have some decision, either external, such as a court case, or an agreement with the feds, and we'll talk about that, where their EPS program displaces the OBS program, the OBPS program from the feds. At the same time, leaving the carbon levy in the hands of the federal government. So this makes it tricky when those that want to be involved in it, it's really going to see, would you be impacted by the carbon levy? And if so, is the EPS a better program for your site? And what does it mean to you? And I think these are a lot of the questions that our clients are dealing with right now. But something to keep in mind is that Ontario did miss the deadline of September 2018 to submit a carbon pricing plan, and therefore to have it approved. And because of missing that deadline, the federal backstop rules clearly state that their own program will stay for the 4 years once it begins. So I think this is something that really needs to be understood by those that may expect to be facing this program, because for them to actually be facing this, there'll be a lot of political decisions that need to be made before that will actually come to fruition. If you look at the plan itself, when it comes down to the program and what does it mean for the industrial emitters, there is a carbon price, and that carbon price, of course, falls in line with the federal backstop, meaning the aim there was to achieve equivalence with the federal backstop. There is a reduction fund that's going to be very similar to what we had in Ontario on a cap and trade. So as Isabelle said, there are a lot of similarities to both the cap and trade program and also to the federal backstop. It seems to be a combination of the two in a maybe 2.0 light version of both of them. But there is a fund. This fund, the difference with this fund is that it will, compared to cap and trade, it will leverage off of private capital. So I think the number is 4-to-1, having private investors plus the government put money into this fund for emission reduction projects. So that is interesting. The plan, if it comes into effect, would be retroactive to January 1st, 2019. So of course, to the point that market certainty and understanding regulatory certainty, you'd actually go back in time to actually have these rules imposed on you. So it is interesting to be following them, because they may be relevant already today, even though they're not in place. So that's something that we are really recognizing with our clients and understanding what will this program be. You can purchase compliance units. So in a way, it's similar to cap and trade, that there will be those entities that can generate credits, and there will be those that will have to buy. And you can also use, as Isabelle's mentioned, offset credits. So again, quite similar to the cap and trade program. I think it's quite interesting that it's clear that there is a price on carbon in this program. I'm not sure if that was something political in the past that the current government wasn't going to have, but they had put this in, and we believe the main reason for that is for the equivalency determination that they're hoping to achieve. Well, we also know that there will be an aim to have a trading system, a registry in place, similar to what you had in KITS with the KITS accounts in WCI, but that has not been developed yet. Of course, they're still working on the early rules. I think Isabelle also had some of this about who's actually going to be in the program. It's going to have the same sectors as you have under the federal OBPS. And they've also looked to include institutions and greenhouse operators in the thermal energy supply. And I think those three sectors on the top right were included because I think of a lot of the concerns that those sectors had within the federal backstop program. And I think that's deservedly so. I understand that they may not be trade exposed, some of these, but they also were coming out of a cap and trade system where most of them were completely made whole and were given opportunities to reduce emissions over time to end up getting themselves to reduce emissions, but not be forced to do so very quickly. Whereas under the federal backstop, they went from receiving free allowances to a certain level to actually being fully exposed to the carbon levy. Now, saying that, the federal government has looked at ways to allow institutions into the federal backstop, so the OBPS program. So if they produce electricity, they are in the federal backstop. And that's new. I think the ministry themselves were not aware of that, and nor were many others. So yes, it's a new sector, but institutions, hospitals, and universities can, in certain cases, enter the federal backstop. Another issue, topic, is the threshold that's being discussed right now. 25,000 tons versus 50,000 tons. That's not been determined yet, but there is a discussion to have a voluntary participation with a threshold of 10,000. Again, very similar to cap and trade, and also very similar to the federal OBPS program. I think our understanding of these thresholds and additional sectors being added into the program, it really seems to be a understanding to bring as many facilities under the EPS program as possible in compared to the OBPS, and have them not facing what they consider the burdensome carbon levy. So I think that's really the angle that you can see here. What the MECP is looking to do is really reduce the costs on sectors, be it industry or institutions, etc. I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Alejandro. He's going to get into some of the different standards being utilized or considered for this program. And maybe before I do that, one thing that we've noticed is we've run quite a few numbers for different facilities, be it in different industries. And actually, at first look, you would think that most would be better off cost-wise under the EPS program, but we have seen situations where the costs are higher under this new program, at least with the assumptions that we have on their rules versus the federal system. So it's not a clear every facility is going to face lower costs in the EPS system versus the OBPS system. So I think that's an important note to make. And I'll pass this over to Alejandro.
Yep. So, hi everyone. It was mentioned that there are a lot of similarities for this program to the OBPS. So I guess I'll kind of make some references to the OBPS and cap and trade, comparing these performances. Basically, under the OBPS, when it was first proposed, there was only the two methodologies at the top you see there, the sector-based performance and electricity. And as of recently, back in December, it was proposed to add the facility-specific emission intensity for certain sectors and for certain facilities. Now, under the proposed EPS program in Ontario, we see quite a bit more flexibility in terms of the methodologies to give emission limits to facility, and that therefore would include, and they are proposing to include a lot of sectors that were excluded from the OBPS, such as universities and hospitals and institutions in general. For example, the sector-based performance standard, which is in both under the EPS, now there's only really 5 sectors proposed so far to be under that, and that would be cement, iron, steel, and petrochemicals, refineries. And then for the electricity generation, this has now been, I guess, kind of expanded, and then EPS also proposes to have thermal energy generation as a separate standard. Whereas under the OBPS, that was just kind of rolled into a product benchmark for the different sectors. And in addition, we have a separate standard for cogeneration. So that kind of expands the scope of how to cover emissions, which is an advantage to this program, the flexibility of how to allocate, because not all the facilities are the same. And as we've seen from dealing with so many industries, a blanket methodology can't just be applied to everybody. So in terms of the stringency factors, under the OBPS, this is equivalent to what they call the reduction factor, and a similar methodology for determining who gets what stringency factor / reduction factor is applied, and that is the EIT assessment, which was discussed earlier, the emission intensive and trade exposed assessment. And that's essentially just a function of the carbon costs that are as a percentage of your what's called a gross value added, which is essentially equal to the GDP of the sector, or at least how Environment Canada has described it, because there was a lot of obscurity to that number. And then the trade exposure is just a function of your imports and exports as a percentage of your sales, essentially. The EPS, however, has proposed a second route to assess these sectors, and that's I imagine that's where a lot of they took a lot of comments from the OBPS and have kind of tried to upgrade this and provide a lot more flexibility for this. The second route is if your normal EIT assessment, let's call it, comes out as low or medium or just not high enough to be high, they've decided to look at the trade exposure metric individually. And so if your trade exposure comes out to be above 30%, then you're automatically classified as high, regardless of what the first part of the assessment was. So this includes quite a bit of industry from what we've seen. Virtually all of the industries we have dealt with are above 30% in Ontario, which is a very trade exposed province. So we imagine a lot of sectors will fit the high EIT risk category, and then those facilities therefore will have the stringency factors that you see there at the top.
Thanks, Alejandro. I'll just go on basically our last slide here and into some of the issues that are the next steps and where can we go from here. I think Katie will take it away from that. Some key dates. The deadline for commenting on this EPS proposal is March 29th. The stakeholder consultations have been held by the MECP in different industries and sectors over the last few weeks, including this week. I think this is the last week where they're having their stakeholder consultations. The plan will have the final regulations completed by June 2019. I think it's important to understand that there is a court case coming up. They do want to have a plan in place to go to that court case to show that they have something that can be that can displace, in theory, the OBPS program. The likelihood of that happening, probably not very high from what I hear from the legal experts. So I think the question is, when would this EPS program become relevant? There's a court case. If they win the court case, then yes. There's a federal election. If a conservative government comes in and removes the carbon backstop, then the question is, will actually Ontario want to keep this program? And that's an interesting question, because if that's the case, there would not be a carbon levy. So would an institution that's going to no longer face a carbon levy want to be in this program? So there's some fundamental questions that you need to ask yourself under the different scenarios. And I think which for us, we did receive clarity from the federal government recently, is that they're adamant that they intend to follow their rules, which state that they're going to keep these programs in place, and that will bring market certainty once they start in a jurisdiction, as they've done on January 1st in Ontario. They stay for 4 years. There seems to be this discussion, that there is a discussion behind the scenes between the MECP and the ECC about having the EPS come into play. I don't think that's necessarily the case. That's not what we're hearing from the federal government. They're adamant that they're going to keep this program. And I think the question is, why would the federal government allow the EPS to displace the their OBPS program, and then at the same time, the feds are responsible for the carbon levy? I don't think that will be seen as a positive thing by voters necessarily. So I think there's some fundamental questions of what will really happen here. Some other things that are interesting to watch for the next little while is OEB's approval of Enbridge adding the carbon levy to their cost of the bills. That will be interesting in regards to the OBPS and the carbon levy. It may be part of the discussions at the court case, et cetera, and what people are facing on their bills. What will actually happen, of course, in this constitutional court challenge in April, and what will happen with this federal election? Will this ever be relevant? And I think to close with what we started with, it is important to bring this market regulatory certainty, because at this stage it's very difficult to make investments in Ontario if you're an emitter looking at greenhouse gas reduction projects or any project in general when you don't know what you're facing over the coming years. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it over to Katie.
Okay, I'm going to jump in with a couple of questions actually from our audience here. So this relates to the slide you just showed.
Can I bring it back up? Sorry.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. You can just put that one back up that you just had, if possible. So the question is, will the proposed program only replace the federal backstop if the court case goes in favor of the province? I know that they've clarified that the proposed program will only go ahead if the federal government approves it. But yeah, how does the court case play into that? Will it play into that?
Sorry, I missed the start as I was fixing my slides. Will the program...
Will the proposed program only replace the federal backstop if the court case goes in favor of the province?
My quick answer is yes. That's the only scenario where I see it happening.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a risk, a real risk, that even if the elections are won by the Conservatives, and they do themselves remove the federal backstop, then the question is, will Ontario actually implement their own EPS program? And I think it's a question that we should all be asking to the current MECP leadership. Do you intend to keep this program no matter what, if you have the ability to put it in place?
Yeah, that's a good question. Regardless of how the court case goes, or even how the federal election goes, do they intend to implement it?
Yes.
And then sorry, if we could jump in, the mind map on this is actually pretty complicated too, because of course, if no matter who wins the court case, it's going to be appealed to the Supreme Court as well, and we can expect that appeal will draw out past the election. So, yeah, there are just a number of different paths that this could take.
Right. Mm-hmm. I don't want to steal Katie's thunder here, because I know she's going to talk a little bit about all of these dynamics as well. There's two more quick questions here. One from Peter is, considering the lime industry inherently generates CO2 as a part of its chemical process, why isn't it a good idea to separate process and non-process emissions?
From our perspective, we would agree with Peter. Maybe Isabelle might want to talk about it differently. I think from our perspective, what we would say is, when you look at the federal backstop program, our concern is that the price ramps up so quickly, so shortly, and there isn't an opportunity for innovative technologies to come into play to reduce fixed process emissions. I think there should be an understanding that innovation should come into play and reduce fixed process emissions, but it needs to be in a reasonable time frame. And when you have prices going up the way they do in a federal backstop, and you're not alleviating the reductions on the fixed process emissions, it just becomes very difficult to reduce those emissions, and therefore becomes extremely costly to those industries. So we would agree with Peter, and I think it's more about the time horizon on looking to achieve reductions in fixed process emissions.
Okay, Isabelle, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you. So the federal government has recognized the specific case of lime that is extremely emission intensive, and has set the standard at 95%. It's important, though, to look at this in the broader context of, if we agree that climate change is our most pressing issue, and that science tells us we need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050, we've got to get to it, and we know. This is why I pointed to the Mission Possible report. We know that we can decarbonize these sectors. However, if we don't create a price signal while making sure that we're protecting Canadian industries, if we do not put in place a price signal, where are we going to find the money to invest in innovation that helps us reduce these emissions? So in the case of a hard-to-abate industry, carbon capture and storage has a role to play, but there's also outside of the system solutions that need to be implemented. We need to look at resource efficiency. We need to look at how to use biomass electrification. So there are solutions that are there, and the price helps us finance them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Isabelle. And we have one last question for Michael here. What were the facilities or sectors you found to have higher costs under the Ontario EPS system versus the Fed's OBPS, and how big were those discrepancies?
I think for some confidentiality, as we're still working on this with those sectors, I'd rather not be specific on the sectors because we're still working that out. But there has been the differences themselves, I would say 50% to 80% lower in some cases, and in some cases 30, 40, 50% higher, give or take. So it's been quite all over the place in some of these different facilities we looked at. Maybe Alejandro can add to that. You've done the numbers even more recently. But
again, we can't really get into it, into the specifics because of confidentiality, but in some cases the proposed performance standards by the Ontario government are essentially just as high as the output-based standard under the federal backstop. But those standards in the federal backstop already have the reduction factor applied to it, whereas the proposed standards still have to have the stringency factor applied to it. So in some of those cases, that's where you see the higher costs. And especially as it progresses further down in the later years, you start seeing higher costs. For some sectors, you see lower costs in the first couple of years, and then once the stringency factor gets low enough, that's when you start seeing the higher costs. But it's really just a case-by-case basis. We haven't seen any specific trend depending on the, even within sectors, different facilities might see a different impact.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe just one last one on the fixed process emissions. I understand as well mentioned lime sector at 95%, but there's nothing in the OBPS regulations that says fixed process are part of our decision making and where you are falling under the treatment of 90, 95% or 80%. So I think that's where we get into a real difficult discussion of what are the impacts and what is the treatment of those in that program. And I think it's also important to understand that if these industries are facing extremely high costs, there is just no money for the innovation to go into those funds to find those solutions. So I fully understand the need to reduce emissions. I think we fully recognize the need to reduce the impact of CO2 and the climate change issue, but it needs to come. And I think my point was it needs to come at a reasonable rate so they can achieve those reductions without disappearing. And that is a fact. If you look at the cost that a number of these entities are facing, it's significant. And more importantly, it's very different than what they were facing in cap and trade, which is what they were budgeting for just a few months ago.
Mm. Well, I think the fixed process topic is a very interesting one. It's one maybe we'll come back to for a little bit more discussion at the end of the webinar. So again, if you do have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box. We are going to move on now to Katie. And I am going to, Katie, pull up your presentation here. And so Michael and Alejandro, yeah, you can stop sharing yours and I will.
Yes, I'm trying to unshare.
Okay.
I've lost my, oh, there it is. There you go. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so Katie, if you want to jump in and start talking, I'm just going to pull up your presentation here.
All right. Hi there. Can you hear me, Sarah?
I can. Yeah, sounds great. Just give me a second here, Katie. Okay. Katie, can you see my screen right now? Oh.
I see environmental ...
Just 1 second. Screen share. There we go.
So, I mean, I can just get right into it. I want to thank everybody for joining the call today, especially the hardcores in Ontario. Friday, also the end of March break week. So I will not be as into the weeds as my fellow presenters. I think Isabelle, Pembina, Mike, Alejandro all did a fantastic job setting the stage around, well, more than setting the stage, actually digging in to the guts around where things stand on the EPS proposal here in Ontario. And then also just the considerations that the OBPS, this pricing system, dynamic federally. And also, I don't know about stealing my thunder, but certainly Mike already, well, he mentioned a lot of the things that I was going to raise, but could add a few additional maybe considerations, food for thought to this discussion. So for those of you who don't know, and actually just a quick shout out to Sarah and the Clean Economy Alliance, I wanted to just make it clear from our perspective. Aida has been a fellow traveler with CEA over the course of the last couple of years, including the roller coaster ride that we have experienced recently here in Ontario. And CEA has always done a really remarkable job bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders in coming to find common ground, which is never easy, on core design elements around a carbon pricing program, climate policy broadly, but also doing a lot of really critical education and capacity building across groups. And those are other, NGOs and academics and businesses. And I think this is, despite not having a cap and trade system anymore, we do have a system, or will, maybe, system here in Ontario. And this is exactly the type of activity that it's great to see CEA continuing to do, this kind of education and outreach. So thank you. For those of you who do not know about IETA, Sarah, do you want to go to the next slide, please? And IETA is a group of all businesses from all sectors globally. We came out of the UN process 20 years ago. Actually, this is our 20th year anniversary. And we are a global nonprofit based in Geneva, but we have offices in Beijing, Brussels, San Francisco, DC. I do the managing director globally role, but I am based here in Toronto, so have a soft, very soft spot in my heart for Ontario and broadly Canada, and making sure that it does reach its climate change targets, but do so in a way that makes sure we do it at least cost and harness the power of carbon pricing and market mechanisms. So that really is our jam at IETA. It's engaging with governments at all levels and other stakeholders around the design, implementation, and evaluation, and hopefully alignment, harmonization of carbon pricing programs. We also work in close partnership with a bunch of groups, including those like CEA, around the world, to put on a heavy series of carbon conferences, symposia, workshops, you name it. So if you look at, the core messaging, and I'll get into it in a bit, but, here in Ontario, around its latest EPS proposal, certainly federally, around its OHBPS proposal, but really across the entire landscape globally when we're engaging, again, on behalf of business with policymakers. And these are the tried and true, right, that you're seeing in front of you. The climate results, it's really the environmental outcomes that matter, doing so in a way that achieves measurable greenhouse gas reduction outcomes. So we are not around or supporting the higher the cost or price, the better. It's about the lower cost is what really matters. It's about the measurable greenhouse gas reduction outcomes, meeting that goal. Again, the least cost bit, that is where the compliance flexibilities are baked in. So when we talk about the trading, the banking, these surplus credits, whatever they could be called in Ontario, or their, the surplus credits in under the federal system, allowances under the former cap and trade system, EPCs in the Alberta system, but having those tradable units matters, allowing for that linkage matters in these offset opportunities as well. The certainty and stability, which is what we're really struggling with, right, at this stage here in Ontario, but also across Canada, not knowing about the future shape of these programs and policies, or even if they'll be there, that is incredibly challenging. And I want to echo what Mike had said earlier around, businesses, definitely in the Ontario context, they're going so hard right now, and there's such kind of fatigue, and it's beyond just these carbon pricing systems that are in place or could be in place, but also the interactions with these other policies and measures that are under development right now, existing, such as the clean fuel standard under development federally. Ensuring competitiveness, this is where it really is important to understand how the EIT facilities are treated, having a robust, defensible approach to their treatment to address competitiveness-related concerns. It also really starts to matter how trade partners and competitors are, who are putting a price on carbon, are addressing their EIT sectors to make sure that, in fact, you are leveling that playing field for your local businesses, facilities, rather than giving them a leg up, right, compared to the partners and competitors that that are in the same international marketplace game that they are. And then again, avoiding that overlapping regulatory or the duplicative regulatory landscape when you have these carbon pricing systems to ensure that there's true complementarity across these other measures, rather than having overlap, duplication that is double dinging businesses and potentially consumers. So the next slide, please, Isabelle. Just to take a quick snapshot, I want to give a shout out to the Delphi Group, who many of you know. I have always been impressed by their map making capabilities, so I want to make sure that we just always keep in mind the latest carbon pricing landscape here in Canada, where you have obviously the BC and Alberta systems that are existing have been blessed, at least for now, as equivalent under the federal act, and so they do not have, they're not takers of the backstop. You have Saskatchewan that is a partial taker of the federal backstop. Manitoba, which is currently the taker of the federal backstop program. However, recently it has come to light that they're at the highest levels. There could be some negotiating, or I should say renegotiating, between Manitoba and the federal government around all or parts, potentially, of Manitoba's program to no longer be backstop. So I would just flag to watch it and see how it plays out in the Manitoba context. Obviously, Quebec cap and trade. Nova Scotia, we were on a phone call with the government earlier today. They're moving ahead with their cap and trade system and now really gearing up to look at other core design elements, including offsets, green fund design. And then I want to, and then you can see the rest on the map. But what Mike had said earlier, and just I want to emphasize the importance of the plans that were submitted, or the deadline of submittal for provincial and territorial plans to the federal government in order to be evaluated, and therefore decisions made by the federal government around all or partial backstop application to the jurisdictions. September 1st, they are taking it very seriously federally, and both formally and informally, they have made it clear that Ontario did not submit a plan on time. Therefore, it will not, all or parts of the federal system, even if parts of the federal EVP or the Ontario EPS program look to be equivalent or potentially, equivalent, that the federal government, because it did not submit by the September 1st deadline, it will not be considered, again, for all or partial compliance until the review period in 2022. Now, there can always be politics or negotiations, things can happen, but in all the communications state federally, they have indicated that they're not going to be entertaining that for the province of Ontario, again, until the 2022 review period. So again, it makes it extremely then challenging to see, or how should I say? Let's go to the next slide. Actually, so there, your current landscape. So when we take a step back and say, all right, what are the bigger knowns, unknowns in this context? You have obviously the constitutional reference cases that are playing out in this country. You have the federal OBPS. So that has not been finalized yet, right? That's really important to point out. Federal performance standards, we don't have that clarity yet. Federal market infrastructure participation, not entirely clear yet. It hasn't been finalized. The eligible offsets, from where, what vintage, what project types, international recognized units, will they be eligible? If so, what does it look like? Usage constraints on these tradable units. Again, the CFS interactions. These are all still playing out federally. And we do expect to see that final regulation soon around the OBPS, but it's still underway. The Alberta election, we expect the Alberta election to be announced next week, and then the writ drops, so then 28 days from that. So we're looking at a federal or an Alberta provincial election, likely in the mid to late April timeline. I highlight this because how Alberta election plays out in the future of Alberta's system, does it become an all or partial backstop jurisdiction if the new government chooses to no longer have a pricing program in place, a provincially administered program? If it chooses to get away with the levy in Alberta, but it maintains the market, industrial market, the CCIR, will there be modifications? If so, could it be blessed or not by the federal government under the backstop? So I think it's just important to keep an eye out for that Alberta election, again, which is right around the corner. Obviously, the federal election is on everybody's mind. And then I just want to also highlight the international cooperation. So as the the future of the international Paris Agreement decisions, especially around markets and cooperative approaches and accounting for international units across borders, that's important to also watch for federal government in Canada, but also Ontario if it chooses to accept or utilize some of those international opportunities and units in its program. Next slide, please. So digging into the constitutional reference cases a bit more, we all know that Saskatchewan and Ontario, they're playing out in real time. They are taking the position that the federal carbon price is seen as unconstitutional. Saskatchewan, the hearing took place last month. Ontario have it's scheduled for April next month, mid next month. We're expecting clarity on both by the end of spring. But then, as Alejandro mentioned earlier, it's a Supreme Court time. So again, this uncertainty will likely play out for much longer than any of us would like around those constitutional challenges. I'll just make it clear, we are an intervener in both courts. We are the only business intervener in both cases, and we are supporting, I want to make it clear, climate action and policy stability. We're arguing that the federal legislation is constitutional pursuant to the federal government's shared jurisdiction over the environment. Okay, an existing jurisdiction matters normally within the constitutional ambit of the federal government. However, in IETA, the federal legislation should not be allowed to encroach on areas that are exclusively within the jurisdiction of the provinces. So we're the only intervener that is raising the argument through a shared jurisdictional lens. And we feel really strongly that no single issue begs for the promise of more of a cooperative federalist approach in Canada to be realized more than climate change. So we did not take it lightly to be an intervener in this case. And if you want to learn more about our arguments and our involvement, I'm happy to follow up with Aida's factum and further information. So the next slide, please. These were all just Sarah, I know you're going to be sharing the decks after the presentation with the entire gang, but I want to make it clear some of the high-level messaging through Aida's business lens around the OBPS design and implementation. So the broad stuff, clearly echoing my earlier sentiments, but on the more detailed input on the proposed OBPS regulatory framework, the bigger concerns we have are around the current proposal for usage and expiry limits on compliance units, supporting voluntary participation, strongly supporting it. We're happy to see it in Ontario's proposal. The involvement of non-facility market participation, we largely support and would like to see them get involved sooner rather than later. But we'd also like to see then a clear commitment by the federal government to an offset system, which we haven't really seen quite yet. And again, this also could really apply to the Ontario entities. Treatment of electricity, talked about it earlier, we won't get into that. Sarah, I know I'm running out of time, so just the next slide, please. And then on the Ontario proposal, in the core messaging here, you need to address competitiveness, that flexible, compliant, cost-effective approach. We're very happy to see the blending of private-public revenue, the avoidance of duplicative non-complementary measures, driving that alignment harmonization, the world around voluntary reductions, really that's offsets. It'd be nice to see Ontario leverage a lot of the work it was already doing under the cap and trade system. Certainly we want to see that cooperation with the federal government as it's moving ahead with its offsets program and allowing or ensuring that complementarity with international rules. And I think the final slide, I won't go too hard into this, but with the international cooperation, this is around how the Article 6 piece is playing out right now this year. It will be top of mind around the accounting for the transfers of units across borders. So I would just encourage everybody to keep a close watch on this. You have a project that's currently underway between IETA, the University of Maryland, and Pacific Northwest Lab that's looking around or at the cost savings associated with trading versus not trading by parties to the Paris Agreement. And these are not small numbers. So really, ballpark even conservative, you're looking at 2030, a ballpark of $330 billion a year in cost savings that could be realized through the use of these cooperative approaches, these tradable instruments across borders. So again, this could have a real impact around business investors in Canada, but also Ontario. So making sure that Ontario, as it moves ahead with its program, should it be, see the light of day, and if not Ontario, then certainly Canada federally, that there is a recognition and there's an embrace of the power and opportunity associated with the international markets in Article 6. And I'll stop there. Sorry for taking up too much time, Sarah. Back to you.
No problem. Thanks, Katie, so much. How many carbon pricing systems do you have to monitor personally? Just looking at that.
And I'm sorry, for part of the reason why I'm not on the webinar is because I'm getting ready to leave the country again tomorrow after just getting back to the country last night. So globally, there's over 50 carbon pricing programs that are in existence or are being proposed. Many of them have tradable components to it. And myself, I haven't really touched all of them, but I'm deeply, deeply involved in those across the Americas, which are over 20 of them right now, subnational and national. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. I definitely want to thank Katie Sullivan from Aida, as well as all of our panelists today for sharing their immense expertise in this area. And, you know, if anyone has follow-up questions for any of them that weren't answered today, you can definitely reach out to me, Sarah Buchanan, and I believe you all have my email from the webinar, and from the many emails we send out as the Clean Economy Alliance. If our presenters are okay to stick around for like 1 minute, I'm just going to allow if anybody wants to type in any more questions into the Q&A box. Whoever can stick around can probably take one more question. But if not, I'm just going to open the floor to any of our presenters who want to say a last word about anything, to just go ahead and unmute yourself and say a last word. And if not, and there's no more questions, I don't see any. Okay, well then I am going to go ahead and thank everyone so much for their time. As I mentioned before, we are going to post this whole webinar, the recording, and the slides on the Clean Economy Alliance website, cleaneconomyalliance.ca. So that will be there. And if you want to comment on this, you have feedback for the Ontario government, you want to weigh in on maybe the extra sectors that they've added in, or how effective or not effective it's going to be, according to you, in reducing emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in Ontario, you have until March 29th to do that on the Environmental Registry of Ontario, which is open to all individuals, organizations, businesses who want to weigh in. And if you have any questions about that, you're obviously welcome to reach out to me as well. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to end it there, and have a lovely rest of your day. Have a lovely Friday and a lovely weekend.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, Sarah.